Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 47 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today's commentary is covering Numbers chapter 8 and chapter 9 through verse 14, and Leviticus chapters 1 through 3. I'm primarily going to be looking at the Numbers 8 and the beginning of Numbers 9. Leviticus 1 through 3 really covers how the sacrifices are to be performed and how the blood is to be dealt with and the body disposed of the sacrifice, how the blood is to be sprinkled around the altar, how it is supposed to be an animal without blemish, and again giving us that picture of the Messiah being without sin, the Messiah not having a broken bone. You will remember that when Jesus is on the cross and the time for preparation for Passover, which we're going to look at just briefly in chapter 9 of Numbers, that the Romans are told, well, you need to get these bodies down and they need to be dead, and basically you need to break their legs. And they break the legs of the other criminals, but when they come to Christ, he's already dead. And then they stick the spear in his side and water and blood gushes forth. And so they don't break his legs. And again, this is because he had to be that perfect lamb without blemish. And it just shows how the Lord was working through that setting already. So it starts out in Romans 8, again focusing on the lampstand. I want you to realize there's a great importance to these things, and that's why you will hear them repeated over and over. It's not just for the Hebrews at that time making sure that they had this specific mindset down, but it's for us to remember the importance of the elements of the tabernacle and later temple, and how they will apply to our lives. As I mentioned, that the Hebrew people, especially at the time of the temple, referred to the menorah as the light of the world, and even referring to the temple and the city of Jerusalem by that term as well. But Jesus, the Messiah, when he is on the Temple Mount, he refers to himself as the light of the world, and refers to himself later as the bread of life even. So he addresses the different elements of the temple, and in particular these different articles, but then refers to him as being those. So we see that. Now realize in the tabernacle, the menorah is the only light that's in the tabernacle itself. So there's no other light there other than maybe the burning coals off the altar of incense. So Aaron's given specific instruction as to how he is to light the menorah, how he's to keep it lit and have this function daily there. The Levites are then presented before the Lord, and the people laid their hands on the Levites laid their hands on the sacrifice. It's this picture of who is going to perform the particular services. So it's really awesome. It would have been amazing to have seen this ordination service. But if you missed it, the Levites are given specific time period that they're to serve. And we're given at one point 30 years of age, and here towards the end we're given actually 25 years of age. And you might say, well, why this discrepancy? Why these different dates if you happen to catch those? And I'll say a part of it's because they would actually begin their true proper service at 30 years of age, but the 25 was the beginning of their apprenticeship, learning how they would perform in their priestly duties. But the wild thing is at 50 years of age, they retired from that service. And this is at a time when people were still living quite lengthy lives. I don't know why the 20 years of service, really, because from 30 years of age to 50, of course, 20 years. So I don't know why that. It wasn't to say that once they reached 50, they no longer did anything in the temple, but they didn't perform the arduous task of carrying the elements throughout the wilderness. They didn't have to set up the tabernacle. They weren't performing the heavy sacrifices. And it may just be because of the sheer number of Levitical priests that there were, to give everybody that opportunity for service. You know, when we move forward to Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, now we really get the picture that he's an older man and still serving, but they cast lots to see who's going to perform the service at that time. And the lot falls to him. Now, maybe the older men would have served that particular task of going in and burning incense on the altar of incense. I don't know when that time period would have changed of having an older man in there. But I think it is interesting how this is laid out, how they would serve an apprenticeship, then they would serve for 20 years, and then they would essentially be retired from that service. Not meaning that they wouldn't be taken care of. Remember, later we'll see how this is laid out, that the people, so make no mistake, they weren't just giving 10% to the Lord. They were actually giving 30% in a sense, because they were giving 10% to the nation proper. They were giving 10% to the temple for its upkeep, and then 10% to the priest. And so they were being taken care of. The other aspect with the Levitical priest is that the Levitical priest, they don't have an inheritance as the regular tribes do, because their inheritance is in heaven. They are taken care of, and they're not having to worry about this inheritance of property and lands, because the scripture speaks of their inheritance being in heaven. Well, that's where the true believer's inheritance is. Our wealth and our inheritance is in heaven, which we will see. Well, I just want to briefly touch on this. We're going to see the Passover many times throughout Scripture. But this is really the first time that the people would have been celebrating the Passover after the original Passover in Egypt. And it's the Lord who basically reminds, hey, it's that time. You know, I told you, you're going to celebrate this as a lasting ordinance. And someone said, well, why do they have to be reminded? Well, you know, time passes, comes up pretty quick, doesn't it? So they're being reminded. Now, I did want to just lay this out for you in case you noticed this. There's a name change here. Aviv was the time that the people were told to celebrate it. And then you say, but now it's Nisan. How did this change? So the Hebrew months changed during the captivity in Babylon. Not the actual time period, but the names of the Hebrew months changed. I don't know how this was allowed to happen, why it happened, but they did. So Nisan is now the name that we know of, but this came about during Babylon captivity. So just in case you notice this change or this shift in the months there. So Passover, why is it being celebrated? It is to remind the people of God freeing them from their slavery in Egypt. It's to remind the people of how God provides for them. It's to remind the people that they are to live lives consecrated unto the Lord and free of sin, just as the bread is free of leaven. I believe when the Messiah is celebrating what we know of as the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper, we know he's celebrating this Passover meal, but I believe when he says to them, do this in remembrance of me, it's not just speaking of bread and wine. This is speaking of this meal where you once celebrated this meal to remember that you had been slaves and captives in Egypt. I want you to now remember that you were slaves and captives to sin. And now Jesus has set you free from that. Now, this is short. I'm compacting a lot in just those words. But Jesus is so much a picture of this Passover meal. As I mentioned, the matzah bread, the bread without yeast in it, he was that perfect picture of that because he's without sin. And when you see the piece of matzah bread, you see that it has bruises or burn marks on it, in the sense of that the Messiah bore bruises for us, and he was striped. And if you look at a piece of matzah bread, you will see the stripes on it. And there's also piercings on the matzah bread, in the same sense that the Messiah was pierced for our transgressions. He's that perfect picture. And I think as we would sit and celebrate the Passover meal, we would see Christ all through that meal. I believe it is set up as an ordinance that we would always remember having been not only slaves in Egypt, but remember having once been slaves to sin, and that we're now free. We're given this picture of a group of men coming and saying, well, we're unclean and we can't celebrate it. What do we do? And Moses does what everyone should do. He doesn't just try to come up with an answer on his own. He goes to the Lord and asks the Lord what to do. Never be afraid when an unbeliever or when another believer asks you a question that you don't have the answer to. Never be afraid to say, give me a little time and I'll come back with an answer. And then pray about it. Seek the Lord on it. Go into the scriptures about it. And then return to that person. So they're given 30 days basically. It says, the next month then you can celebrate this meal. So they're told though that they can't just say, well, it's not convenient right now. This Passover meal is coming on the first day of deer season, and I've got to be out deer hunting, or otherwise I'll miss it. You can't do that. It's not saying you can just come up with any excuse. There has to be a legitimate excuse or reason as to why you're going to miss that meal. And so just saying the Lord gave them grace that if they accidentally touched a dead body, let's say, a family member of theirs died and they had to be a part of preparing and burying that body, well, then they would be unclean for the Passover meal. And so now they're given these days that they can then wait, prepare themselves, and participate in the meal again. And I think the reason why the 30 days is because 50 days later would be Shavuot, or would be the day of Pentecost. And that is a remembrance or a celebration of when Moses came down off of the mountain with the Ten Commandments. We're going to see that celebration come up. Leviticus chapter 23 is the chapter which speaks of each of these being given as a lasting ordinance, each of the 5 feasts of Israel. Well, brothers and sisters, I will end there. I know we could go on, and I love to teach and talk about Passover. That normally is about an hour and a half teaching, though, if I cover the entirety of Passover and how it connects with the New Testament believer's life as well. I do hope that your day's going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.